Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, for being here tonight. And thanks to David and the WFA for having me back. What I want to do tonight is take you through a broad story. So we're not going to be drilling down into too many specifics, but we will dip in and out. And I want to tell you the story tonight of the experience of French Canada in the First World War, which is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As a Canadian born in Quebec, not a native French speaker, but still, this is kind of close to home for me. And I think it's an interesting story and one that is worth talking about because Canada's role in the First World War is, I think, at least partly relatively well known. Let's put it that way. Um, the First World War is also part of Canada's official memory. For many Canadians, it's part of a founding moment in our national identity. Now, historically, of course, that can be disputed, but emotionally and politically, it cannot. It is a part of the national story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. However, for French Canada, for the French-speaking part of the population, the First World War is a much more complicated experience. It's got a much muddier and more mixed legacy, and it is mired in controversy. And I'm going to try to give you an overview of why that is the case. It's a story about the war and about fighting, of course, at the front, but it's also about politics. And it's about politics that are so bitter that some say that Canada, by 1918, was on the brink of civil war, which is something we don't very often hear, particularly if most of you or many of you are from the UK. That might not be a side of the Canadian story that you've been exposed to before. So that's what I'm going to try to do, is give you a sense of Canada's divisive First World War experience, focusing on French Canada, and try to trace the line of those tensions through the war experience. And before we dive in here, I want to give a shout out to my colleague back in Canada, Sophie Soulière, who helped me with some of the research on this topic. And also, as far as the images are concerned, most of them are from Library and Archives Canada, unless otherwise indicated. So I've got the legalese out of the way. First off, how about a definition, right? I don't want to bore you with definition of terms, but interestingly, perhaps, the term French Canada we still use in English, but it doesn't really exist as a cultural identity anymore. It did at the time, but today it's a little bit different. French Canadians define themselves by the province they're from and not as a cross-national group as much. In addition, in Canada, we use a lot of shorthand to describe the two groups, English-speaking Canadians and French-speaking Canadians. We often just say English and French, and we don't mean English people from England and French people from France. So I might slip into that. So if I do unintentionally, you know who I'm talking about. It's going to be all about Canadians tonight. Now, let's start with every historian's favorite visual aid here, a map. Now, this is a modern map because I couldn't find a good one that showed the population distribution of French speakers in the country back in 1914. But this gives you an idea as to the distribution of where most French speakers lived in 1914, because they still generally live in those places today. There's been some shifts, but it's more or less similar. And you can see that the vast majority of French Canadians then and now live in the province of Quebec, and the second largest group live spread out in the north and east of the province of Ontario, the two ones that I labeled on the map for you. So you just get an idea. They're not evenly distributed across the country by any means. And this is politically significant, right? So in 1914, Canada has a population of just over 7 million people. And of those, about 28.5% are French speakers. Most of them live in Quebec, 1.5 million, but the biggest minority group, let's say, outside of Quebec is in Ontario, and there are about 250,000 there. And that is going to be one of the biggest hotspots that we'll be talking about in the context of the war effort and encouraging or discouraging French Canadians from participating. So what do these 2 million people live like? what does everyday life look like? What's a typical French-Canadian situation in 1914? So we can get an idea here of what kind of people we're going to be talking about when they end up in the trenches or almost on the barricades a little later in our story. First off, French-Canadian society is intensively rural. Now, of course, English-Canadian society is also largely rural, but it's particularly pronounced for French Canadians. The vast majority live in the countryside and in small villages like this one you see here, which happens to be my hometown of Mascouche in southern Quebec. My parents' farm is just about a mile down the river to our right, if we're looking at this photograph. And it was also when this picture was taken. So rural, that's very important. We can see here a bit of a typical scene other than the team that's hitched up there. And then, of course, a presentation about French Canada wouldn't be complete without a maple syrup producing shack, which you can see here. They don't look that dissimilar today if you go for the real thing in spring, which I recommend, of course. But these are just a few scenes to give us this idea of this rurality, right? So most French Canadians are not connected to the beating heart of Canadian politics in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, for example, right? There are a couple of larger cities in Quebec. This is Quebec City, typical street scene here. And of course, Montreal is at that time the largest city in the country. And here's a nifty little scene at night of a Montreal factory producing shells during the war. But Montreal in this time period is not a really predominantly French-speaking city. It's an island of English in a mostly French rural province of Quebec. One of the other things that's important to keep in mind is religion. French Canada is intensely Catholic, not only culturally. They never got the memo, right, about the French Revolution, republics and stuff. No, they'd already been absorbed into the British Empire before the French Revolution happens. So there's not a very significant Republican movement at this time in the early 20th century. Society is generally conservative and generally religious. And this is a kind of a folksy painting showing some villagers leaving midnight mass in a typical village. And this is not only a cultural thing, Catholicism, but it's also a political factor, right? And here we have Pope Benedict XV, who has a lot of influence in the Catholic world. And in Quebec, a political movement called Ultramontanism, it's not that important, but the Vatican, what the Vatican says is important to a lot of French Canadian intellectuals, politicians, and priests who have a lot of influence in these villages. And we're going to see that that sets up some political fights with the establishment in Canada, the people who dominate government, business at the federal level in particular, and in Montreal, and that is English-speaking Protestants, many of whom are not big fans of Benedict here, as I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear. So, in the lead up to the First World War, the big question, I guess, if you will, that underlies a lot of the tensions in Canadian politics that come out in the First World War in a real dramatic way is how British should Canada be, right? This is, I think, the basic question underlying a lot of these conflicts. And here we see, I was very happy to find this cartoon because it kind of sums up a little bit of the three answers, in a way, the balancing act that Canadian politicians have to do if they want to be able to navigate the different streams. So essentially, there are kind of three answers, and we'll get to who these people are in a moment. But there are essentially three different proposed answers to this question of how British should Canada be. One is the French-Canadian nationalist response. And that's here on the right side of the scales, saying that the Prime Minister in the early 20th century, Wilfrid Laurier, who's in the middle there, is too British, right? So the main idea of French-Canadian nationalists at this time is that Canada should be a French and English-speaking country, and it should be as independent from Great Britain as it can. So not getting involved in any imperial adventures, not feeling obligations towards Britain, certainly not embarking on any wars on behalf of Britain. Then you have, represented here on the left, waving the little Union flag. Then you have the Anglo-imperialists, right? And this is the biggest bloc, the dominant, more or less dominant bloc, the bloc that's governing in 1914 through the Conservative Party, who formed the government when the war breaks out. And their idea, of course, is that Canada's British. That's what it is. That's our identity. That's our role in the world. We're a part of the British Empire, and the British Empire is us. And there's no real place for these ideas of French Canada being equal, of Canada moving away from Britain. They're not interested in any of that. They feel British culture is superior to French Canadian culture and institutions, and that should be the guiding structure for us in Canada. And then you have the moderates, in this case represented by the longtime prime minister, but who is the leader of the opposition during the war, Wilfrid Laurier of the Liberal Party. And they basically accept that Canada is a part of the British Empire. They accept the achievements in their eyes of British civilization and empire. And they feel that it's an advantage for French Canada to be a part of this civilization with its parliamentary institutions, with its liberties and rights and property rights, and so on and so forth, and free trade and prosperity and so on, all the things people associated with British imperial civilization at the time. And so they're trying to navigate, the moderates, the Liberal Party, they're trying to navigate between these two, not necessarily extremes, but these two more robust ideas, let's say, more mutually exclusive ideas. Because the Liberal Party draws its support from Quebec and from moderates in the English-speaking parts of the country. So they need to sort of have a policy of compromise, okay? Now, that's as complicated as the political stuff and new names and parties is going to get. So I'm trying to keep it manageable, but let's refresh our memories before we move on. This guy is important during the war. He's Wilfrid Laurier, the leader of the Liberal opposition during the war, former prime minister. Then we have Robert Borden, who's the prime minister during the war from the Conservative Party. And of course, he represents this more imperialistic political culture. And now there are many French Canadian nationalists in the press and in political parties in Quebec and so on. But the most prominent one, and the one that we will stick to for tonight, is this guy, Henri Bourassa. And he was involved in politics, but he founded a newspaper. And that newspaper is going to be a major vehicle for him to express his ideas during the war in all of the messy conflicts that we're going to get into for the rest of our talk this evening. So 3 big answers to this question of how British should Canada be. And of course, every time there's some kind of political crisis to do with empire or to do with violence, these 3 are at loggerheads, right? And I want to highlight, in the pre-war years, there are 3, I think, particularly relevant conflicts. The reason why these people on your screen, these children, are protesting. One is about the language of schooling, right? So according to the Constitution, there can be French schools and English schools, even if it's for a minority. So I went to English school, even though my town's majority French, because that's our constitutional right. And French Canadians in Ontario were also exercising that right until 1912. And the Conservative government of Ontario decided, no, this is divisive. We don't want to encourage French. And so they introduced legislation that essentially banned French schools. And this is a huge flashpoint. And it's going to be even bigger when the war breaks out and people are asking French Canadians to serve, when they're removing their ability to go to school in their own language at the same time. So 1912, the schools question for 250,000 French Canadians in Ontario becomes a very, very hot topic. The other two are a little older. One is the Boer War, which I'm sure you're all relatively familiar with. The war breaks out, and there's a big row in Canada. What should be Canada's role? And it goes back to the same positions that I've outlined before, right? At that time, the imperialists are really pushing we should mobilize all our militia, we should send everything we have to support Britain in the fight against the Boers. The French Canadian nationalists say, why? Why should we help this empire that conquered us conquer someone else, essentially? And so the moderates are stuck in between this, and the solution isn't directly important for us tonight, but it's to only send volunteers, and only a few thousand. So there is a contribution. They are fighting for the empire, but it's not too much. It's not pushing. It's not taking French Canadian villagers and forcing them into uniform, for example, right? Those are, I would say, the two hot button issues that are fresh in everyone's mind when 1914 comes along in terms of this conflict between English and French Canadians and imperialists, moderates, and French Canadian nationalists, right? What this does is it creates this idea amongst many Anglo-Canadians that French Canadians are not to be trusted. They're not really with us, right? They question it. They don't really believe in what we believe in. They might be disloyal. And this is a word that comes up regularly in the Anglo-Canadian press. And I'll give you a taste as to that, the depths of the resentment with this editorial cartoon that shows Sir Wilfrid Laurier, right, who at the time is leader of the opposition again, and that, implying that if he toys with this idea of a bilingual Canada, it's political suicide, right? So it's a threat that the Liberal Party will be irrelevant if it continues to try to accommodate French Canadian desires for linguistic equality in Canada, right? So you'll all be happy to know we've gotten to 1914. The war breaks out on the background of all these tensions. And at first, in Quebec, and this is the front page of one of the largest and most influential newspapers in Quebec, in fall 1914, at first, the major media companies and the elites, essentially, and the church, the higher ranks of the church in Quebec, not in Rome now, support the war effort. They basically have a deal where they say, with the Anglo-Canadian establishment, unofficial, of course, saying, yes, we understand this is the imperative, and we support the war effort. And this headline, for those of you who don't read French, says, French Canada will have an immortal page in the history of valor in the war, right? Because French Canadians are going to support the just cause. And then we have a little editorial cartoon here that shows, it has the motto of Quebec on it, Je me souviens, I remember. And it shows Quebec, that's the woman standing on the right-hand side of the two, offering her sons to Britain, to the empire, to the motherland, the new motherland, let's say. So you do have a surge of support for the war at the beginning, on the official level, let's say. Not every villager is enthusiastic about it, right? Even Henri Bourassa, our symbol of nationalism here, even he says, okay, I agree that the Allied cause makes sense, the British and French cause makes sense, but he doesn't want Canada to go too far. He wants Canada's participation in the war to be voluntary. But as time goes by, debates in the public sphere become hotter and hotter, right? Because there's more pressure to do more for the war from the imperialist side, and there's more resistance then on the French-Canadian nationalist side. To the extent that we get comparisons on the French-Canadian nationalist side between Ontario or Anglo-Canadian imperialists and the Germans, and this idea of the Prussians and how they're against democracy. Well, the Anglo-Canadians are interfering with French-Canadian constitutional rights by banning schools, for example, right? So that's the message behind this cartoon. where we see an Anglo-Canadian politician wearing the Prussian helmet and threatening the innocent French-Canadian child in Ontario who wants to go to school in his own language, right? And the title says Chez les Boches, which is amongst the Huns. So using that wartime language, but not against the enemy, against what some French-Canadian nationalists considered the internal enemy. And I want to mention a quote now from one of Bourassa's articles, one of his opinion pieces that he wrote in the paper. He wrote, "In the name of religion, freedom, and loyalty to the British flag, we urge the French Canadians to go and fight the Prussians of Europe. Will we let the Prussians of Ontario impose their domination as masters sheltered by the British flag and institutions?" So, I mean, those are fighting words, especially in the face of wartime sensitivities and censorship and so on and so forth. So it gives you an idea as to the type of discourse that's going on. It doesn't mean that every individual citizen feels as passionately and as bitterly as Bourassa does, but that is a strong and widely held emotion. That doesn't mean, however, that all French Canadians feel that way. There's divisions within French Canada. They're not all nationalists. Some are moderates, right? Some of the intellectuals, I should say. I'm talking more but now about the intellectual, political, business elite, and so on. One of Bourassa's former allies who joined his nationalist league, who wrote similar type articles in the press before the war, is a man by the name of Olivier Asselin, a journalist and one-time politician. And he joins up. This is him in uniform. He becomes a major in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and he sees action. So French-Canadian elites are also splitting, even amongst the former nationalists. And then you might have someone like Talbot Papineau, who's the descendant of a very famous French-Canadian rebel leader from the early 19th century who rebelled against British rule. Now, his family was mixed then. He was raised mostly in English, but still partly French-Canadian. He joins with the very first contingent. And he writes, he's also the cousin of Henri Bourassa. So it's even a family affair sometimes, as it is for my family as well, but we'll get to that shortly. So you have people like Bourassa who are extremely opposed, and then you have people like his cousin or his former allies, former colleague, who are serving in uniform and supporting the war effort. This is how Papineau writes about it. This is how he justifies it. He writes an open letter to Bourassa in a newspaper in 1916. And this is what he says. It's a very long letter, but I like this little segment. "As I write, French and English Canadians are fighting and dying side by side. Is their sacrifice to go for nothing, or will it not cement a foundation for a true Canadian nation, independent in thought, independent in action, independent even in its political organization, but in spirit, united for high international and humane purposes to the two motherlands of England and France?" So you can see this is taking some of those objectives of the nationalists and mixing them in with the war effort, right? You want independence, you want one Canadian nation. The war is how we can achieve that, right? And it's interesting because that is sometimes echoed in Ireland, sometimes echoed in India as well, that if we contribute to the war effort, we can also achieve our own nation-building goals. All right. How does this work in practice? We need an army. It's an institution. The army needs to function. The army needs to convince French Canadians to volunteer because, of course, at first, we don't have conscription. Well, now that gets off in 1914. It starts off on the wrong foot a little bit. This man, Sir Sam Hughes, is the Minister of Militia at the time, and he's responsible for coordinating the mobilization. And he is as orange as they come. And he is not interested in equality for French this or French that. He scraps the pre-existing mobilization plan for a different one. There's no place for the traditional French-Canadian militia units that existed before in his new mobilization scheme. There's no high-ranking French-Canadian officers in the new army, and there's no French-Canadian unit that is created in the first contingent. So the first big group of Canadians, which eventually becomes the first division, first Canadian division that goes over to Europe in late 1914, not a single French-Canadian unit there, only Anglo ones. There are some French Canadians who volunteered, but they have to serve in English. What happens then? The leader of the opposition, Laurier, himself, right, a French Canadian, in case it wasn't clear from the name, and other prominent French Canadian moderate figures, they lobby Ottawa for a French Canadian unit, for the creation of a French-speaking battalion, and then they get it. And this is a unit that still exists today, becomes the 22nd Battalion, later the Royal 22nd French-Canadian Battalion, and it is created with the help of private finance. French-Canadian businessman Arthur Mignot puts up the money for this French-Canadian battalion. It's filled with volunteers and former militia officers from Quebec mostly, and it ships out. And here they are, shipping out from the port in Quebec City in 1915. They head off to England for training. Their commanding officer is this man, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Louis Tremblay. Tremblay is one of the most famous, oldest names in French Canada. And so, yeah, he's a militia officer who ends up in command of the only French-Canadian unit at the time. So what that means is that if we're interested in the French-Canadian experience in the war and tracking it, where are they? What are they doing? What are they experiencing? We are forced to kind of look at the 22nd because there's no other French-Canadian unit that ends up in the field, right? Most French Canadians don't serve in the 22nd, but it's very hard to get a cohesive idea of their experience without looking at the 22nd because they're just mixed in everywhere else. On the attestation papers, which are all online, the Canadian archives, you can go and look at every soldier's papers when he signs up, where he puts his name, his religion, his height, his next of kin, his address, and so on. But it doesn't say, what's your first language? So it's quite difficult. This means we have to estimate. And there are different studies trying to estimate in different ways based on place of birth or based on partly on last name, even though it's very tricky because some people have a last name that could be both. Some people have a last name that's French, but their family's been assimilated and they don't know a lick of French, and so on. In the end, it's estimated that between 35,000 and 70,000 French Canadians served in the military in the First World War. And that corresponds to less than their share of the national population. So maybe around 20% of the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, French Canadian, versus almost 30% of the population. And this, of course, during the war is a huge topic. Imperialist press is saying French Canadians are not doing their bit, they want to hold back, they're disloyal, and so on. At the time, of course, that wasn't known. It was just an accusation. However, once you remove British-born from the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the gap between Canadian Anglos and Canadian Francos becomes less. In any case, let's take a look at some recruiting posters because the drive to recruit happens also in French, right? So here you have a recruiting poster that is trying to appeal to all sorts of different ideas. So if you look at the text, the list here, it says, for the king, for your patrie, your country, for France, for your blood, so your French-Canadian race, the pride of the race, right? For humanity and liberty, you should join up. So they're trying to hit all the bases. They're trying to appeal to anything that might motivate a French-Canadian, right? So patriotism towards king and empire. If you don't like Britain, maybe you like France. We'll throw them on the list. Maybe you're proud as a man of your own culture, so you should fight. Or maybe you're a humanitarian, you believe in liberty and humanity, so then you should fight too, right? Here's another one directly appealing to the connection to France. The headline is French Canadians join up, and it shows a French Canadian and a Frenchman in the typical kind of 1914 style uniform. So they're playing on a hopeful connection to France. And here's the last recruiting poster I'll show for another unit that basically shows a typical rural setting, says that this unit is recruiting pure Canadians, so real French Canadians, right? At the time, the word Canadian in French usually referred only to French Canadians. They called English Canadians English, period. That was my nickname on my soccer team, on my football team, for example, as the only English-speaking Canadian on it when I was a kid. And here again, they go for patriotism, but also for humanity and then cultural pride. Do these ideas work on French Canadians? Well, we have a nice little placeholder here of the 22nd in some trenches. Well, yes and no. France is a distant place for French Canadians. Only a few wealthy intellectuals have ever been there, have read French literature. The values are also not quite aligned. France is a republic, right? A secular republic. French Canadian society is deeply, deeply religious and locally focused. It's so rural and religious that the international affairs, and that's also a response, of course, to being a minority in the British Empire, in British Canada. These international questions don't hit home quite as much as they do for a lot of Anglo-Canadians. So there's an issue there in appealing to French Canadians on the backdrop of these tensions, right? Why should we volunteer for Britain's war when we're not allowed to go to school in French in Ontario, right here next to home? Another problem is once those French Canadians do volunteer, all those other units, let me skip back for a second. This unit is the 178th French Canadian Battalion. This one is for the regiment of the Voltigeurs de Salaberry. This one is for the 230th French Canadian Voltigeurs. They only exist on paper. What happens in practice is that all the French Canadians who sign up to these advertised units, they get assigned in England or already in Canada to other units. So these are just like recruiting placeholder units. And at the front, in the active army, there is only ever one French Canadian battalion in the entire CEF. And so you have the vast majority of French Canadians who don't speak English, and yet they have to then learn English on the fly. It's tough enough joining an army and being trained as a civilian. Imagine doing it in a language that you can barely understand. Sergeant majors are not particularly understanding, no matter if you're a French Canadian in an English unit or not. And this is a real recruiting barrier. But the Army High Command is drawn from this Anglo-imperialist group and is not particularly concerned about that. To give you an example, there's a great collection of letters published in French by French Canadian soldiers. One of them is a gunner in the artillery. Artillery, all English, right? His name is Francis Bouchard, and he writes home about his training. And he's brief, but he's to the point. He basically says, I've started training on the guns. It's very hard. Everything is in English, and I don't understand a word of the language. And I've read quite a few accounts like this, one where the Canadian YMCA serving the soldiers, right, gives one of the French Canadian soldiers a book. He can't read the thing. So what does he do? He's got a ready-made stash of toilet paper then, for as long as he can carry that book with him. That's what he reports. So this is a major barrier to French Canadian recruitment, and it contributes to these tensions. It contributes to the idea that English Canada is not accommodating French Canadian needs and desires. And it contributes to the idea in some English Canadian circles that French Canada is disloyal and is not willing to do what's right, not willing to participate in the war effort. So I hope that's clear as mud so far. Let's shift gears now and talk about the combat experience, right? So I hope that we're getting an idea of the tensions, the political conflicts, some of the motivations or lack of motivations, and some of the institutional problems that come with this French-English divide in the country. But of course, the men of the 22nd, they're in the same muddy trenches, fighting with the same rats and with the same Germans as everybody else, despite whatever's going on back home. And their real baptism of fire, or among the worst experiences, let's say, for French Canadians who end up fighting, is the Somme. And that's a pretty British and imperial experience. And the 22nd is sent in as a part of this later big push during the Somme offensive on September 15th, famous for being the day when tanks are first used, right? And they're sent in to capture the village of Courcelette, which is a place that many of you have probably heard of before. They're in the second wave. I put a little blue box around the 22nd Battalion, and they're one of the 2 Canadian battalions that is slated to head right into the village and seize it from the Germans while they're sort of on the run from the advances made earlier that day. And here we have a bit of a more detailed sketch. You can see the lineup of the different companies of the 22nd on the right-hand side, and they're taking the eastern half of the village of Courcelette. They have to cross some open ground first, capture a couple of trenches, and then take the village, which they do. And here's an image of Canadian troops on the way to Courcelette. It's not clear if it's the 22nd or not. Here we have the village. So again, this is a typical type of First World War combat experience for them. And they do take the village. And they take the village in a wild series of hops, skips, and jumps and bayonet charges and hand-to-hand fighting. During the advance, the Lieutenant Colonel, Tremblay, that I showed you the picture of earlier, he's buried in trenches and shell holes 3 separate times and is dug out by the men as they're advancing. And here we see the results, right? Heavy losses, Canadians being treated in the trenches on their way back from the front lines at Courcelette. And I want to share a couple of quotes to give you a sense of how the men in this unit experienced the fighting. And the first one is from Captain Joseph Chabel. This is what he says about the fighting at Courcelette. The fight at first was fierce, a hand-to-hand, no weapons barred combat. Bayonets, rifle butts, shovels, feet, teeth, all came into play. Blood spurted out of punctured breasts, brains spilled from skulls shattered by rifle butts. Bayonet fighting is a bitter struggle to the end, with no mercy shown. The sensation of driving the blade into flesh between the ribs, despite the opponent's grasping efforts to deflect it. You struggle savagely, panting furiously, lips contorted in a grimace, teeth gnashing, until you feel the enemy relax his grip and topple like a log. So that's some pretty intense stuff, especially when he's not thinking about that at the moment, but when you know that back home, half at least of the people don't think you should be there suffering an experience like that. It makes the French-Canadian experience a much trickier one in some ways than the English-Canadian experience, where the home front support is much stronger. The lieutenant colonel who was buried, Tremblay, said after Courcelette that if hell is as bad as what I've seen at Courcelette, I would not want my worst enemy to go there. Now, about 800 men of the 22nd left their jumping off trenches on the 15th of September to attack Courcelette, and at the end of the day, 188 answered roll call. It doesn't mean that 612 were out of action completely. There were stragglers. They reconstituted to some extent in the next days, but they only ever made it past about 300, if memory serves, after Courcelette for a battalion. Now that's pretty under strength. Here you see some other Canadian wounded moving back after Courcelette. So that's a pretty awful experience. And that's, one entire cultural group, their one battalion is decimated in one morning. It reminds me a little bit of the experience of the Newfoundland regiment on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, although the stats are not quite as horrific as they were for the Newfoundlanders. But it's the same sort of principle, a small society suffering quite intense losses. The thing for the 22nd Battalion, French Canadian Battalion, is that it happens twice in the space of 2 weeks. Because on October 1st, 1916, they're assigned in, again, the second attempt to take a position just a few hundred meters north of the village of Courcelette, where they suffered so badly, a position called Regina Trench, which you can see here highlighted in red. The little dark geometric form next to the word division at the bottom of your screen, that's the village of Courcelette. So they're right on the heels of where they were on September 15th, just 2 weeks later. And this is really the end of the battalion, the end of this version of the battalion. As you can see, the little black arrows showing where the different Canadian battalions go, and again, I've highlighted the 22nd with the blue square, they all turn back because this assault on the 1st of October is a pretty crushing failure. As they're crossing no man's land, the 22nd comes under friendly fire from Canadian and British guns, and they take losses from that. Then there's a German counter barrage. Then, of course, there are the usual German rifle and machine gun fire. Only a handful of men from the 22nd make it into Regina Trench, and they're immediately killed, essentially. So the battalion is nearly wiped out, and it needs 900, more than 900, 934, if I recall, replacements. That's basically a complete reconstitution of the battalion. So they've essentially been wiped out in these two assaults on the Somme, one successful and one unsuccessful. And one of the soldiers, his name was Alphonse Masson. He wrote to his wife. He survived both Courcelette and Regina Trench. And I think his letter to his wife gives us a little bit of an insight as to how they tried to deal with this kind of trauma. Alphonse writes, "I'm happy to have come out of it alive. In 15 days, my battalion was decimated twice. What a horrible thing. Who protected me? Maybe your righteousness, your prayers, and those of our little daughter. I really hope to be sent to hospital on account of my ear. Sunday morning, a shell passed so close to my head that I was unconscious for 10 minutes. So here you see this deep faith, Catholic faith, in the power of actions, of rituals, right? His wife saying prayers and the rosary bead or what have you might have been, in his mind, what spared him from the fate of most of his comrades. This is a picture of German prisoners taken from Regina Trench by Canadians being led back, but it's a bit of a deceptive picture because most of the time at Regina Trench, things did not go the Canadians' way. So that's a taste of what awaited those French Canadians in the trenches on the Somme during their worst battles. But of course, they also had experiences behind the front in France, kind of a unique experience in a way as French-speaking British Empire soldiers. For one thing, French Canadians funded and set up 2 hospitals in France. One was funded by the same businessman who funded the, skipped ahead there, who funded the 22nd Battalion. And those French Canadian hospitals, they didn't only serve Canadian troops, but they served French troops as well. And that's what we see a picture of here because they had the skills, they had the language to be able to do so. So here there are some casualties from Verdun being treated at Canadian Hospital number 8. And here we have a French-Canadian nurse, Lieutenant Lavallée, who served at French-Canadian Hospital number 4. But of course, when the men are on leave or moving up to the front through villages, they have a different experience than their Anglo-Canadian counterparts. Here, some Canadians helping with the harvest as a symbolic picture here. Now, I've mentioned that the French connection, if you will, is not necessarily so strong because of history, because of cultural differences, but it does mean something. Either for the first time in their lives, because of the war, French Canadians and French people in France meet each other, and there's a connection that occurs, a warm sort of cultural connection. Or you have more intellectual types like Major Asselin or Major Papineau, who we talked about before, right? Educated officers who already have this, let's say, idealistic idea of a connection to France, and it's strengthened by their experience there. One of the regular soldiers who'd never been to France and would have never been to France if it hadn't been for the war was Alphonse Couture. And he wrote home about when his unit arrived in a French village and what happened. Since we began to sing in French, soon the villagers are in the street and embrace us, giving 1,000 kisses, and are very surprised to hear us speaking French, wearing English uniforms, and speaking French the way that we did. Drinking water is unknown to them. Rather, we had enough good wine and beer to fill our gourds. So he comes from a more conservative society than France, and a society that is not where wine and alcohol don't play as prominent a role. So to him, that was quite the cultural experience, getting some wine from happy French villagers. Many Frenchmen don't know that French Canadians exist at this time and think that all Canadians are what they at the time called savages, what of course today we know to call Indigenous Canadians or Aboriginal Canadians. And so they're shocked to see these people speaking a strange to them variant of their own language. And it's something that touches French Canadian soldiers, and they often mention in their letters. Back home, though, in Canada, things are heating up quite intensively. By the middle of 1916, the pool of volunteers, be they French, English, or whichever, is drying up. This is an ancestor of mine, my great-great-uncle, born in England, immigrated to Canada just before the war. He signed up in 1914 right away. He was killed at Second Ypres. People like him, there aren't anymore by late 1916 in Canada. What to do, right? Those who are left often have good jobs in a booming wartime economy, and it's still all volunteer. Now, in 1917, Prime Minister Borden, you can see him on the left there, he visits France. And the big topic is, where do we get more men? The Canadian Expeditionary Force cannot replace its losses with the level of volunteering. It's suffering particularly heavy losses in 1917, especially at the famous Battle of Vimy Ridge, which ironically, in a way, is now the big symbol for the birth of Canadian nationhood to many Canadians. But it's one of the big motivators that causes Borden to decide to push through conscription, which is opposed in Quebec. And opposed by some other Canadians, but especially opposed in Quebec. So the Military Service Act becomes law in August 1917, and it's going to be fully implemented in January 1918. So that's when people get uniforms, in January 1918. This causes a massive political crisis. Here you have a Western Canadian newspaper headline. Okay, conscription bill becomes law, but Montreal mob signs say death to Borden, who's the prime minister. So we're in a place of extreme tension. This is why some historians start talking about Canada being eventually on the edge of civil war because of the tensions from conscription. Society mostly splits on linguistic lines. Most French Canadians oppose it. Most English Canadians are for it, but there are some farmers groups, some trade unions, and most recent immigrant communities, other than British immigrants, also oppose it. What do the moderates do? Like Laurier, the opposition leader, they want a referendum. So we shouldn't impose conscription. unless there's a vote, like they tried in Australia, right? But the Conservative government says, no, we're not voting on this, it's going to happen. And the Liberal Party splits in half. The vast majority of the English-speaking members of the opposition party joined the government in a union government. And the rump is mostly French Canadians, not exclusively, but mostly in Parliament in Ottawa of the opposition. Of course, the debate is vitriolic in the press, right? French Canadians are slackers and so on. Here's a quick quote from the Manitoba Free Press. There's no longer any reason why the whole truth should not be spoken about Quebec. The people of the province have been ranked quitters throughout the whole war. They've been prolific in excuses and evasions and nothing else. The general election that's coming up in 1917 of December 17th is to decide whether or not they are to take charge of Canada for the remainder of the war. So, conscription, even though it's already law, the implementation of it becomes the question in the December 1917 Canadian federal election. You have the Union government running on a ticket of conscription, and the moderate liberal opposition, which is almost all French Canadians at this point, running on a ticket of no conscription without a referendum. And this is an example of an election poster from the Union side. Are the slackers in Quebec to rule Canada? If you vote against the government, yes, you want the slackers in Quebec to rule Canada. Fairly blunt, yeah? And we think that bitter politics is something recent sometimes, not necessarily. And just to make sure that they're going to get elected, the Union government passes another law that changes who can vote. It's probably the most undemocratic election in modern Canadian history. They allow women to vote in 1917, but only women who have male relatives in the military. So obviously they're going to vote mostly for conscription because they think it's only fair, right? The wives of other people whose husbands or brothers or fathers have not voluntarily joined up, they don't get a vote. And this can sway the vote by up to, it's estimated, 400,000 or so. Also, immigrants from Central Powers countries who've come since 1902 are not allowed to vote either. And of course, the Union wins easily in December 1917. You can see here some Canadian troops abroad during the election. Here are some Canadian nurses voting during the election because they're allowed, right? If they're serving or if they have relatives serving. In Quebec, however, the opposition wins 62 of 65 seats. So it's an absolute landslide against conscription. But it doesn't matter because the Union government retains a majority and they start to implement conscription. And it leads to scenes like this: protests on the streets of Montreal against conscription. 93% of men ask for an exemption once conscription is passed. There are demonstrations like this, but there are also violent riots. One of them takes place in Quebec City in April 1918. A rioter actually fires on troops, on Canadian troops, who fire into the crowd and kill 4 people. The government also invokes martial law, which means you're not allowed to gather, you're not allowed to say something that's hostile to the war effort, and so on and so forth. The government also brings in English Canadian troops from other provinces, essentially to garrison Quebec City and Montreal and other military installations in the province. Here's a headline from a Quebec newspaper after the shooting at the riots in Quebec City: 5 civilians killed by soldiers at Quebec City. All right. This is why we talk of on the brink of civil war sometimes, although it's arguable. My great-grandfather, Albert Chabot, from my French-Canadian side, was conscripted at this time in early 1918. He was a single man and they were first up on the lists. So you can imagine that this doesn't escape the attention of soldiers like this young man of the 22nd French Canadian Regiment who are fighting in France. It's hard to suffer and sacrifice like that when your homeland, your home country, people you know, maybe your own family are divided in the way that French Canadian society was divided, Canadian society was divided. It's probably also very hard when you see that your colleagues in uniform in Canada are shooting people like you. Not for people, but still, it was unprecedented political violence in Canada in the previous 40 years. So this is a big deal. And yet they fight on. Of course, I won't go through every engagement now in 1917 and 18, but they fight in all the major campaigns. Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Passchendaele, Talbot Papineau, right? This descendant of the French Canadian rebel leader of the 19th century who wrote to his cousin, Henri Bourassa, saying that we should have one nation. The war will help us achieve that. He's killed at Passchendaele in October 1917. And a newspaper in Quebec says that it hopes that his death will cause his cousin Bourassa to reflect on the damage that he's done to his country by opposing the war effort. So you can see those divisions, even a death is used, in the political sense. My great-grandfather, whom we just saw, loses his arm in August 1918 on a personal note. Future Governor General of Canada, officer Georges Vanier, seen here on the left with the former Queen, he loses a leg in 1918. Then the regiment wins both of its Victoria Crosses, is awarded both of its Victoria Crosses of the First World War in summer 1918, during this period of intense tension at home. You have Lieutenant Jean Briand, who's awarded the Victoria Cross for leading multiple attacks against machine gun positions and a field gun, German field gun position. He receives it posthumously. And Private Joseph Cabel also receives a posthumous Victoria Cross for defending his position until he was killed. Then you have an engagement like at the village of Chérisy, where every single officer in the regiment is killed or wounded on a single day, on August 26th, 1918. And right next to that engagement today is the CWGC, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's Quebec Cemetery, because a Montreal Anglo battalion was also fighting there. And so Anglo and French Quebecers are resting here in Quebec Cemetery. And then to top things off, the 22nd Battalion parades across the Rhine and participates in the occupation of the Rhineland after the signing of the armistice. What does it cost French Canada, this war effort? It's impossible to say for the reasons I talked about earlier. We can't say how many French Canadians were killed or wounded, but we can know how many who served in the 22nd were killed and wounded. Of 5,500 who served in the 22nd Battalion, 992 were killed and 2,900 wounded. It's a casualty rate of 70%, which is pretty typical for an infantry unit in the First World War. This is the war memorial in the town next to mine. My town doesn't have a proper First World War memorial because not that many villagers served. The next town's a little bit larger, and here's the memorial. It's a sign of the times because the memorial is not particularly prominent. The First World War is a very traumatic and divisive experience for French Canada. The narrative of national unity and national birth that kind of takes hold and becomes influential in English Canada, it never takes hold in French Canada. So English Canadian families who feel the need to give meaning to the sacrifice of those who died can turn to certain narratives, certain ideas, certain justifications, understandings of the war that French Canadians often can't, right? Because it doesn't touch their society in the same way. They didn't experience it in the same way. Most First World War memorials in Quebec were put up by the English-speaking minority community there, my community, right? And not the French-speaking majority. So that memory is completely different. The First World War does not figure prominently in French-Canadian public memory. What figures prominently about the war is conscription, that the English-speaking majority imposed this political choice by force against French Canada's interests and wishes. And this caused a lot of French Canadians to reconsider the political situation. This is one of the important legacies that's with us in Canada as well today. As we discuss the legacy under the gaze of this French Canadian soldier here, this idea that Bourassa had, the nationalist had, of a pan-Canadian independent nationalism where French Canadians could live in different regions of Canada and be equal to English Canadians and be separate from Britain. This idea is weakened by the war, by conscription. Many French Canadian thinkers decide it's not possible anymore for this vision to be equal and independent from Britain. French Canadian political life and discourse starts to focus more and more on the province of Quebec only. As the center of political life, that's where we have some power, they say to themselves. We can elect the government there. That's where we can protect our rights best against the majority outside of Quebec. And so this is one important step on the road towards the development of modern Quebec nationalism and identity and the independence movement that you know of today and that I grew up very much affected by in Quebec. So I'm going to end the presentation there. I hope that you have a better idea now of just how messy the First World War experience is for French Canada on the home front and in the trenches, and also the very mixed and thorny legacy that it has left, even for someone like me, an inheritor of that legacy more than 100 years later. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much indeed, Jesse. That was absolutely fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was. I was so pleased when you suggested this because it's an area that we just don't know about in the UK. I'm sure colleagues, WFA members in Canada may be somewhat aware of it, but that was a real eye opener. I'm going to kick off with a question that's on my mind. You said about the 22nd Battalion being very badly hit at Courcelette. Post Courcelette, was it backfilled by French Canadians, or was there some dilution of English speakers that went into it in order to refill the battalion?
It was filled mostly by French Canadians from these other units that were then broken up in England for replacements, not only for the 22nd, but yes, they tried to backfill with French Canadians. There were a few English Canadians who served in the 22nd, but they were mostly either members of the English Quebec minority like me who would be able to function in French or had learned enough French somewhere else to be able to get by. As far as I know, it was the vast majority French Canadian replacements were sent, yes.
Thanks very much.
No
Peter,
problem.
first up, thanks for your question. Do you want to ask Jesse your question there?
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. I mean, like David, I found that fascinating. I hope my question doesn't display the sort of ignorance that David suggests that a lot of us have around this issue, but I'll try it anyway. To what extent, if any, did the British government seek to interfere in or influence the issue of recruitment to the Canadian Army? Did it, for example, help with money or propaganda or political pressure?
That's a great question. I'm going to be honest, I can't answer it with any degree of authority. What I can say is that, one of the contributing factors to the decision to impose conscription was the Imperial Conference in 1917. This was one of the forums that Prime Minister Borden and his delegation of union government members, right? They left that conference resolved to do it. So it was partly from his visit to the front, partly from the advice of the Army brass, Canadian Army brass. But yes, there was some influence of the Imperial Conference on it. On the other hand, Canada was a self-governing dominion, so its domestic policy was its own decision. And of course, we have the counterexample of Australia that decided not to impose conscription, although Australia was more successful with its volunteer campaigns than Canada was, because they managed to mobilize a higher proportion of their male population than Canada did, right? So the short answer is, I don't know. The long answer you just got.
That's good enough. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Peter. Dave Pitcher, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Hello, Jesse. Another great talk, thank you. How were the Van Doos, the 22nd, regarded at home?
Well, I guess that depends on who you ask. One of the things, the short answer is they were well regarded. Anybody who knew about what things were like, what was going on at the front, the performance of various units, there were no complaints there. So one example of that would be that one of the reasons why they were in the position they were in at Courcelette, in the vanguard of taking the village, is because their lieutenant colonel volunteered them for that assignment. And part of his motivation was, I'm going to show all these Anglos that we're not slackers over here, right? They can say what they want, but my men who are here in this battalion, they're not slackers. So he volunteered his own men for this very difficult task that cost many of them their lives. And one of the letters I didn't quote talked about how as they moved back to billets after Courcelette, other Canadian units had heard already about what they'd achieved and were cheering them by the roadside as they went through other villages where other units were billeted. So as far as, their combat performance, I don't know of any disparaging remarks or negative opinions. On the contrary, they were held up as what all French Canadians should be, right? You slackers should be volunteering like them, right? To make a better world, to defend British civilization and so on. So I don't know of any shots taken in their direction.
Was that the same in Quebec?
That also depends on the media organ, for example, because of course different newspapers are associated with different editorial positions. Bourassa, for example, held back on directly criticizing the men who are serving. In fact, especially at the beginning of the war, he didn't really say we shouldn't be involved in the war. He just said, how can we be involved when all this is going on? His rhetoric got a bit more extreme when conscription came around. In Quebec, it was mixed, but all of the establishment essentially supported the 22nd and the French Canadians involved in the war effort. Where the question became difficult, where you have a lot more people then being a lot more hesitant, is about conscription. That was the real problem question.
Rightio, lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave, for your question. Thanks very much. Paul Cobb, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, it's great to hear a presentation about the colonials, which is an area of interest to me. Thinking about Borden's relationship with French Canadians, there's a parallel in Australia, of course, where Hughes was daggers drawn with elements of the Irish Catholics. And I'm sure that his paranoia was one of the main reasons why both referendums failed. Now, Robert Borden, of course, was acutely aware of what was happening on the Russian front and on the Western front. So do you think he had no choice but to crack on regardless with Military Service Act in Canada and take the consequences? Or do you think he could have taken a slightly more cautious approach, bear in mind that Laurier at the start of the war said that Canada should do everything that it could to support Britain?
Yes, Laurier did say that. Laurier supported the war effort, right? His only red line was on the question of conscription. He didn't want it to be unilaterally imposed. He wanted there to be a popular vote, a referendum on it. I mean, I suppose you've asked me a question about me more than about Borden in a way, right? What do I think he could have gotten away with or not gotten away with? He certainly felt it was an absolute necessity. That's clear. I think, I think it was a choice. He could have not imposed it, But that would have changed the capabilities of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1918. Not astronomically, because as it turned out, of course, no one expected the war to end at the end of 1918. So most Canadian conscripts never saw action. My great-grandfather is one of the exceptions who saw action and then who was crippled because of it. So in hindsight, he could have easily gotten away with it because, yes, they would have been then under strength in 1918 a little bit, but they would have been fine. Of course, he didn't have the luxury of knowing that Germany would crack when it did, and they were all expecting a significant campaign in 1919. I still think, based on the Australian example, who mobilized more of their men through volunteerism, but who also suffered proportionally higher casualties than the Canadians, that he could have done it. Now, one of the wild cards in me saying that, or he could have not done it, let's put it that way. One of the wild cards in me saying that is, could he have kept his own party support? Or would he have lost his own position, right? So I think theoretically, yes, the government could have not imposed conscription. As a Canadian, for the long-term health and harmony of my country, that would be the better decision from that narrow point of view, right? But he might have lost the support of his own country and not been prime minister for very long, and then someone else would have been chosen and could have then imposed it as well, because they had a crushing majority. The Union government had an absolute crushing majority once nearly all the Anglo-liberals went over to them over conscription. So.
Okay, thanks. Certainly, I think the end of the war was the saviour of the Australian Imperial Force. No doubt about that at all. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for your question there. Cam.
Thanks, Jesse. Great presentation again. I wonder if you have any sense as to how the French-Canadian conscripts would have been treated by the veterans of the 22nd, for example. Were they welcomed with open arms, or was there maybe a bit of animosity towards these guys who were, kind of forced to go over there, whereas the volunteers they volunteered to go? Any sense on that?
That's a good question. I don't, again, I feel like this isn't my greatest hits here, this question period. I don't know for sure, but I think in general, I don't know of too much open resentment towards conscripts in the CEF generally, and I can't imagine why in the context of a combat unit like the 22nd, it would be much different. For what it's worth, anecdotally, in the family lore of my great-grandfather as a conscript, no, there was never any story of that nature. That's not scientific, but it's a little bit of anecdotal evidence. In the Second World War, the question of conscription came up again, just for our non-Canadian viewers, and there was quite a bit of resentment for some time amongst the fighting troops towards conscripts, because for some time conscripts were not sent overseas. They could serve just in Canada for quite a long time. So you have this quote-unquote zombie army that provoked a lot of resentment amongst frontline troops. But once conscript arrives on the front lines, there were not significant tensions in the Second World War. There's more literature on this for World War II. And for the First War, there wasn't that much time, right? The idea was to send the conscripts. They just didn't get time to send all of them. So there wasn't the same institutional opportunity for resentment that there was in the Second War, where they were serving in Canada for a couple of years before they started to be sent.
Yeah, the resentment idea, I'm stunned at that. I would think you'd be happy to get guys in your unit. But I guess on the other hand, if the guys come over there to Europe and they're totally green and they don't know what they're doing, could be a challenge. And also,
all armies become majority conscript armies of the major powers. So Canada here accepted, Australia accepted, right? So the British Army, it's mostly the conscripts who are doing the fighting in 1918, and the French throughout the entire war. So if you have too much resentment, the institution's not going to function. So somehow armies were able to avoid that scenario. And as far as I know, it wasn't particularly significant for the CEF either. Of course, it helps that only some tens of thousands arrived. So there's still a very small minority of troops. I guess in that way, you don't have group dynamics that can build, perhaps, if the situation were different.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Cam, for that question. Yeah. John Beach has not got a microphone or a camera, so asks, did French Canadians not want to serve in the French army units? I guess what John's driving at there is, was there any ability for Canadians, or French Canadians, to go over to France to join the French army?
They could join the French Foreign Legion like anybody else. And there's one case, on the name escapes me, but he wrote a very interesting memoir. He was a writer before the war, and then he volunteered for the French Foreign Legion as a French Canadian and spent the war fighting in French formations. He eventually transferred to the regular French army and fought there. But that is very much the exception. I mean, we're talking of a very small handful of individuals, and I only know of one in particular who wrote anything, who published anything afterwards. So theoretically, it would be possible, but it's a statistical non-factor, I would say.
Thanks for that. Thanks. Sarah, over to you.
Hi, my interest is actually in the medical side of it, nurses especially, and you showed some nurses voting there. Now, do you know how many of the Canadian nurses that went over were French Canadian as opposed to English-speaking Canadian?
No, we don't have that kind of statistical ability to tell of all the nurses, because again, we have this problem. Even if we know the name, we don't necessarily know that person's culture or identity or first language, because there's some mixing over time and so on and so forth, right? But what we do know is that the majority of the nursing personnel of those two French Canadian hospitals were French Canadians.
Okay.
I think, if memory serves, now my colleague Sophie found me this statistic and I've gone and forgotten it, but I think it was 26 French Canadian nurses versus 12 Anglo-Canadian nurses at one of the two French Canadian hospitals in 1915 when it was created. So yes, I think it's safe to say that we're talking multiple dozens at the least in the two French Canadian hospitals.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Sarah. We've got a couple of questions about the 22nd Battalion, Jesse, so I'll just ask these on behalf of various people who are asking about that particular battalion. The orders that were sent from division or brigade down to the 22nd Battalion, did that have to be translated into French? You're shaking your head, that's obviously a no there. So whilst it was a French unit, they accepted, in inverted commas, orders in English.
Yes, I mean, the CEF is an Anglophone institution, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. There's no, oh, please, Brigadier General or divisional headquarters, send us the orders in French. It would be respectful. There's none of that. It's understood that it is an enclosed French-speaking unit. What happens at the battalion level, under the battalion level, is in French. What comes to the battalion from above that is in English. And what comes from the battalion up is in English as well. That's as clear as day.
That makes perfect sense. I can't imagine that going down particularly well if the orders had to be translated into the French language.
There are ways. Think of the Indian Army, British Indian Army. Think of the Austro-Hungarians. You can push it to some extent. Of course, you need certain command words, but there could have been more flexibility there, let's say, in theory, but in practice, it wasn't practical.
I suppose the staff work is difficult enough without actually having to then start.
Right, and then you would not only need staff officers who were bilingual, you would then need commanders, perhaps as well, who might be bilingual at a higher level, and there just wasn't that. First of all, there wasn't the political will to institutionalize that. And second of all, the pool of militia officers or the pool of experienced surviving officers from the 22nd is not large. So
you just don't need more friction in the operational gears when you're doing high intensity fighting than you need. The other question that popped up, presumably it was a fairly political decision not to create a French brigade within the CEF. Obviously, the numbers of French-speaking troops were sufficient to create a brigade, but one assumes that would have been potentially politically a step too far.
Yeah, it was just not a priority for the type of people who were, running the military and the political establishment that was in office at the time, right? This is not what they were about. They were about the war effort. They were not about accommodating French Canadians in nationwide or imperial focused institutions. It took lobbying from the most prominent French Canadian politician, a former prime minister, and many others to get one battalion created. Yeah. One battalion. So, and that was, the Minister of Militia was fairly reluctant about that at first as well. And it was privately funded. It wasn't even on the government dime at first, right? So Arthur Mignot, this French-Canadian businessman, he put up the money to raise the first iteration of the battalion as well. So, yeah, no, in the political context of the time, that just wasn't going to happen. In retrospect, it would make sense. You would save yourself all sorts of difficulties in the future, Canada, that they weren't or that they viewed differently. And you might also recruit some more French Canadians to the cause, right? Get some of those slackers on board, to use their language of the time. But that's not how they viewed it.
You say the battalion was privately financed. It's obviously the equivalent of the locally raised battalions in Kitchener's army. Was that a unique example of a privately financed, privately raised battalion?
No, there were many. There were many. In fact, perhaps Canada's most famous unit of the First World War, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, was privately financed as well. They were over there so early that they actually joined the BEF before eventually being integrated into the CEF, which is interesting. And I will say that they were funded by an Anglo-Montrealer. So all roads lead to Quebec somehow.
Excellent. Bill, you've been waiting patiently there. Do you want to fire up your microphone?
Thank you. Yeah, Jesse, that was a marvellous social history exposition, and I sort of echo David's introduction. I'm sort of going slightly off-piste here. Come to 1939, what had happened to change the French-Canadian approach to a war in Europe that allowed them to recruit so many regiments to fight in Europe during 1939 to 45?
Well, there are a few differences, but there are similarities. You still have the basic conflict that French Canada doesn't want conscription in the Second World War, that the proportion of French Canadian society that feels connected to the British cause, which in 1939 is the motivation for Canada joining the war, right? It's before, now we tend to think of the war as having a much broader humanitarian cause at its core. But initially, Canada's decision in 1939 to go to war it's because we're supporting Britain again, just like in 1914. So you still have those basic tensions, and they end up with conflict again. But you have a couple differences. Two of the most important ones are, for one thing, it's a Liberal government that's in power in Ottawa. And the Liberal government depends on votes in Quebec. And the Liberal government has a generally more moderate policy towards the war effort than the Conservatives would have liked them to have in the Second World War. So the Prime Minister in World War II, Mackenzie King, was one of those very rare Anglo-liberals who stuck in opposition against conscription in World War I. So he's leading the country in World War II. So he has a much more cautious approach to the war effort. Canada recruits still a lesser proportion of its population to fight in World War II than Australia and then the UK does. And it only imposes conscription, at first anyway, after a referendum where Quebec votes one way and the rest of the country votes the other, but the majority wins. So they have a referendum, then they impose it. but then it's only imposed for serving in Canada. So you have all these kind of gradual softening of the conflict, right? That helps dissipate the tensions and helps French Canada swallow the pill to some extent, although they still put the mayor of Montreal in jail for openly opposing conscription. So you know, there's problems. But the army is smarter about it, if you'll permit me that judgment in hindsight. The army is more, the military is more ready to compromise. The Air Force and the Navy remain pretty much unilingual, but the army does have numerous French-Canadian units, armored units, all sorts of stuff. So still mostly infantry. They have problems filling their quotas, but so do the Anglo units before the conscripts begin to be sent, before they retrain some people for frontline duties. So the fact that there's a government that is much less strident about how to go about the war effort, and the fact that institutionally the army allows the creation or promotes or creates numerous French-Canadian units, it marks a huge difference to the First World War on the foundation of that same conflict.
Thank you very much.
Super. Thanks for that question, Bill. We're rapidly running out of time, so apologies to everybody who's got questions for Jesse, but Jesse is an hour on from UK time, so we do really need to stop it on the half hour, which is coming rapidly up. So, last question, Christopher Watts.
Good evening. Once again, a fascinating talk, Jesse. Thank you so much. These talks on Monday nights just seem to get better and better. Now, I think it's commonly known that the bitterest fighting in World War I and in World War II too was between the Canadians and the Germans. Whenever the Canadians and the Germans got together, nobody took prisoners. I mean, at Falaise in 1944, we have possibly the last incident in the Western sphere, where when the Canadians took Germans, they shot them, and by goodness, the Germans reciprocated in kind. Now, this may go back to Vimy Ridge. I'm not quite sure what the antecedents of this is, but my question is: was this antipathy towards the Germans, the deep visceral hatred, almost unshared by the other Allied armies? Was this common amongst English-speaking and French-speaking Canadians?
Oh wow, that's a loaded last question. We've opened up all sorts of interesting cans of worms. All right, let's start big and go small. Maybe if I can frame it that way. So there is an idea, a kind of a commonly received idea, I think, that the Canadians were particularly that way, particularly prone to showing no mercy and so on and so forth. There are many documented examples of Canadian troops killing Germans in the process of surrendering. The most prominent Canadian historian of the First World War, Tim Cook, wrote a very long and detailed article about it years ago. So there's no question it was fairly common. The question that to my mind is unresolved is, was it more common amongst the Canadians than amongst the British or amongst the French? The reputation says that, but is that, you know, what is the evidence historically for that comparison? I'm not sure that we have enough to say that, yes, for sure it was that. I can say that, generally speaking, French-Canadian soldiers don't behave any differently, don't really think about combat that much, or about the enemy that much differently than their Anglo-Canadian comrades in arms do. In fact, I just read in prepping for this talk and for a related article that I'm writing with my colleague, vicious letters saying, you know, they put their hands up, but it was too late for them, my dear wife, because I was done. They killed my buddy, and I just bayoneted anybody I found. Arms up, not arms up, doesn't matter. So I don't think they were any different in that point of view. In the heat of battle and having lost friends to that enemy, you look at them in the same way. In terms of a combat experience, combat behavior, I wouldn't say there's much of a difference. As for the Canadian reputation, I think more research is needed.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christopher, for your question there. Right, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very grateful again to Jessie for a really superbly researched talk, and to have all that in your hand and able to answer the questions is testament to your skill and dedication to the subject. So I'm
Thank you.
Tremendously grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, just a quick hands up again as a round of applause for Jessie, to whom I'm extremely grateful. And let's reconvene in a week's time for the next webinar. Jessie, thanks very much indeed for your work tonight. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good night.
Mademoiselle.